So, today we're going to talk about the single most fundamental tool our mind uses to build, well, everything. We're talking about the art of abstraction. We're going to see how our brains create order out of pure chaos, why some of our simplest ideas are actually unbelievably complex, and get this, how moments where logic completely broke down actually led to the biggest leaps forward in human reason. All right, let's just jump right in with a question that really you face every single second of your life. How on earth do we make sense of the world around us? I mean, think about it. It's a constant storm of information, right? A flood of sights, sounds, feelings, details. How do you find any signal in all of that noise? There's actually a fancy term for this overwhelming flood. It's called the entropy of experience. It's just the natural, chaotic state of reality that our minds are constantly up against. And to navigate it, to learn anything at all, we can't just absorb everything. That would be impossible. We need a way to filter, to focus, to simplify. We need a tool. So how do we actually go about conquering all that chaos? Well, you can think of it like we all have this thinker's toolkit, a set of mental instruments we use to build solid knowledge out of the raw, messy stuff of reality. And the number one, most important, most powerful tool in that whole kit, it's the art of abstraction. This is the absolute key. It's how we filter reality, how we deliberately ignore the noise so we can finally see the signal. Honestly, it's the very foundation of how we think. So what is it exactly? Well, abstraction is basically the magic trick of taking something incredibly complex and messy and boiling it down to a much simpler, more focused idea. For example, think about a physicist who wants to study gravity. They don't try to calculate the position of every single atom in an apple, no way. They abstract the entire apple down to a single point of mass. This simplification isn't being lazy, it's being incredibly smart. It's pretty much the only way to uncover the deep laws of nature hiding underneath all the details. And in practice, abstraction really boils down to two core techniques. On one side of the coin, you have the abstraction of identification. This is where we actively create sameness. I mean, no two robins are perfectly 100% identical, right? But a biologist decides to treat them as members of the same category, robin, to understand how the group behaves. Then, on the other side, you have the abstraction of indistinguishability. This is all about consciously ignoring what doesn't matter. A chemist doesn't care if the beaker is blue or green, they just care about the chemical reaction happening inside. So one creates useful groups, the other clears away the useless noise. And you need both to think clearly. Now, this whole act of creating sameness, it forces us to ask a question that sounds super simple, but is actually mind-blowingly deep. What does it even mean for two things to be the same? This one little idea has been a puzzle for philosophers for thousands of years, and its story is pretty wild. The whole journey starts right here with what's called the law of identity. A is A. A thing is itself. It feels so obvious, unshakable. It's the bedrock of logic. But as we're about to find out, what that tiny word is actually means, well, that's where all the trouble and all the progress really begins. The evolution of this idea is just fascinating. It kicks off with Aristotle, who gave us the first really crucial distinction. There's numerical sameness, meaning this one specific car right here, and then there's species sameness, like two cars that are the same make and model. Then Leibniz comes along and raises the stakes with a deep metaphysical test. He says, look, if two things share every single one of their properties, they're not two things at all. They are one and the same. The whole game changes again with Gottlob Frege, who shifts the focus to language. He pointed out that a sentence like the morning star is the evening star is actually a huge discovery. Even though both names refer to the same object, the planet Venus, they have different meanings or senses. And finally, we get to Peter Geach, who argues that identity is always relative to what you're talking about. A lump of clay might be the same clay after an artist shapes it, but it's not the same statue it was before. Sameness, it turns out, really depends on the question you're asking. But what happens when you push these ideas of sameness and sets and logic to their absolute limits? Well, you start to find deep cracks in the very foundation of reason. And this is where it gets really, really cool, because it turns out that paradoxes aren't failures of logic, not at all. They are the engines that force logic to get better. Okay, prepare for a little mental workout here. In the early 20th century, the philosopher Bertrand Russell came up with this devastatingly simple question. Imagine a set, and the only members of this set are other sets that do not contain themselves. Got it? Now, for the big question. Does this master set contain itself? Just think about that for a second. And here's the beautiful, terrible trap. If the set does contain itself, well, then it violates its own rule for membership, so it should be out. But if it doesn't contain itself, then it fits the criteria perfectly, so it must be in. It has to be a member of itself if and only if it's not a member of itself. This isn't just a fun little riddle. It's a deep, fundamental contradiction that just blew a giant hole in the foundations of mathematics and logic. This one paradox created a massive crisis for two big reasons. First, it showed that the core logic everyone took for granted had a hidden, fatal flaw. But the second reason is even worse. It triggered something called the principle of explosion. In classical logic, if you can find just one single contradiction, you can use it as a backdoor to prove that literally anything is true, that 1 equals 2, that the moon is made of cheese. The entire system just collapses into absolute nonsense. Logic was broken. But that crisis, it wasn't the end. It was a rebirth. The urgent need to solve Russell's paradox sparked a logical renaissance, a creative explosion that transformed logic from this one rigid black and white system into a whole beautiful spectrum of new ways to think. The result was this incredible diversification of logic itself. So before the crisis, we pretty much just had classical logic, where every statement is either true or false, end of story. But afterward, brand new systems started to emerge. You got intuitionistic logic, which said a statement is only true if you can actually build a proof for it. Otherwise, it can be undecided. This was a huge deal for computing. Then you have paraconsistent logic, which was designed specifically to handle contradictions. In this system, one little paradox doesn't set off that principle of explosion, which allows you to keep reasoning even when you have messy, incomplete, or inconsistent information. So let's pull all this together. What are the big takeaways here? First, abstraction isn't just a mental trick. It's the fundamental art of thought that lets us turn chaos into knowledge. Second, even our most basic ideas, things like sameness, are built on top of a super deep and complex history. Third, and this one's really important, paradoxes aren't failures. They are the engines of progress. They're the stress tests that force our ideas to get stronger. And finally, all this means that logic isn't some ancient, static monument carved in stone. It's a living, evolving toolkit that we are still building and refining to this day. Which leaves us with one final, provocative thought to chew on. We've seen the simple law of identity get incredibly complicated, and we've seen the law that says contradictions are impossible get, well, bent. So, if logic itself can grow and evolve, what unbreakable rule that we all rely on today is just sitting there, waiting for its own paradox to come along and show us that our thinking needs to evolve all over again? That, right there, is the art of thought.